I'm your host, William Laitinen, and welcome to the Talent Equals podcast. So I've been quiet over the last few weeks, and I apologize for the disruption in broadcasting. But unfortunately, my wife experienced a freak accident, which resulted in a head injury. And so, our life got turned upside down. And as I'm sure you'll all understand out there, that the podcast had to take a backseat while I tended to her recovery and the needs of my family. But as with all adversity in life, there are great positives to be found once the emotional turmoil passes. And the good news is that my wife is recovering. She's doing well, fighting hard. And I've had a huge privilege to help her through this difficult time and also be a stay-at-home dad, which has been incredible. But let's take one observation that I've made during my family crisis and see how I can connect it to today's episode. It's a theme of scarcity of time. And we have a scarcity of time in this life. My experience has brought that home to me. We simply just don't have as much time as we think. And so the work that we do should be worthy and ambitious. And while the definition of those goals, worthy and ambitious, are very subjective, they are still a highly effective way of checking in on your life and the satisfaction that you're achieving in your work. So in today's episode, I'm interviewing founders of a highly ambitious insurtech called Supercede. I'm joined by the founders, Ben Rose and Jerad Leigh. Ben and Jerad are reimagining and creating a brand new, fully digital reinsurance ecosystem. That is an ambitious and certainly worthy task for these two gentlemen. They're doing this by re-engineering an entire digital marketplace where all of the players within the reinsurance journey can work on a brand new stage, which they will incentivize through removing mundane tasks, enhancing data collection, and enhancing the digital relationships that those players experience. There is a reason the ecosystem is the holy grail of many startup companies, because he who controls the data controls the universe. And while the logic of an ecosystem as a business is pretty clear and tested, doing it within a 100-year-old industry, which still makes lots of profit, and you're needing to incentivize players to take part, is devilishly difficult. It's definitely ambitious and a worthy challenge for these highly talented founders. So with this in mind, I really wanted to dive into how Ben and Jerad approached this challenge and how they've created the culture and hiring that supports this ambitious objective. Ben and Jerad are very thoughtful and intelligent founders, and I hope you enjoy listening to them as much as I did. And so without further ado, I give you Ben Rose and Jerad Leigh of Supercede. Ben, Jerad, welcome to Talent Equals. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Delighted to be here.
Fantastic.
How are you doing?
I am very well. Thank you very much. It's been looking forward to our conversation. And I thought that's actually what I'd dive straight into, because you guys are leading a company called Supercede. And Supercede means to replace something. So what are you trying to replace?
I'd say not only to replace, but to go one better, I think, in many ways. There's another secret reinsurance meaning to the name as well, which is so that the last part spelled CEDE is the verb to cede or to give away, that's traditionally used in the reinsurance markets to mean effectively a cedent or an insurance company that's buying their reinsurance would be ceding their risk. So we're making that process super as well by replacing the current process, which I'd be happy to tell you a bit more about. Currently, it's how should we put this, across the entire spectrum of reinsurance at the moment. everything is kind of done offline. So from the insurance companies who have to make their pitch to the brokers and the reinsurers, they're doing that in a big zip file filled with spreadsheets. And then the brokers then have to go and coordinate a vast army of reinsurance underwriters who are all going to take, a few percentage points each of each layer that goes out. And they're doing that all with emails and spreadsheet attachments and embedded additional credentials for mysterious FTP sites located somewhere out in the distance. And then finally, as well, you have all of these reinsurance underwriters hungry for deals who only really have access to deal flow from the people they already know, that they've met in person by chance at a conference or down the pub or wherever else they've managed to find room to wine and dine. And what we're trying to go beyond, I guess, is that total offlineness and bring together an online reinsurance ecosystem, or as we like to call it, reinsurance that connects.
And make it super.
Exactly. Yeah. That's the important part.
I mean, Jerad, you're joining us today from the Lloyd's of London building, in fact, right? So,
indeed.
Are you sort of like the Trojan horse then, sort of going in there ready to disrupt this ancient marketplace, or how does that fit with what's already there?
Well, I think and to your earlier question of like what are we replacing? I think it's a lot of our approach is focused on enhancing the way it exists currently works. And you look at Lloyd's being an icon of sort of the traditional distribution model where everyone centralizes in a singular place and they can efficiently connect with, as an underwriter, you're efficiently seeing all the risks that come through the floor. And as a broker, you walk into one location and see all the capacity you could possibly need for your risk. And that was very much reflective of the industry at its inception. And as we come in here, we look at what does the future of this industry look like? And there's lots of remnants and elements of what Lloyd's has done and what this model has produced that we're trying to compound. And as we digitize that and take that into an ecosystem online, reflecting a lot of those same behaviors, finding the right people, knowing which underwriter to talk to or which risk you want to see first, and optimizing it for the modern era. But it's fun to be here as we sort of work to, and Lloyd's is making a huge commitment to this of innovating in the Future at Lloyd's initiatives and Blueprint 1 and 2, around modernizing what this market is and where does it go next. So we're thrilled to be a part of the lab and to be part of this journey that takes Lloyd's into its next sort of step in their process.
Because I sort of hear in that, Lloyd's is renowned for being a relationship-driven marketplace where, there's so much human interaction that's going on in this, incredible building and this incredible space, and where, where did Lloyd's came from? It was this Lloyd's of London sort of coffee house place, right? And so how do you maintain that human relationship in the Supercede kind of ecosystem? If you're trying to create that by taking some of that online, how do you look to maintain those human elements? Or are they important to you? Tell me about that.
I think they're critical. And what's really amusing about this is a lot of Supercede or risk book, as it was initially known, actually came from demand from the more, and I don't want to put a label on this because we had this demand across the board, but in particular, a high demand from sort of millennial population who, for them, relationships in general, even outside of work, were changing in the way that you built them, in the way that you maintained them. We worked particularly with the under 35s reinsurance group here in London and the under 40s reinsurance group in the US, where they were saying, when I need to communicate with people, I use a WhatsApp group or a Telegram group, or back in the day we had Facebook, etc., and Instagram, and all these other solutions that enabled us to not just enjoyably but incredibly efficiently communicate and update and keep in touch with a much larger number of people than historically, where you might have been more dependent on, I'm friends with the 5 neighbors that I can walk to their houses, or the few that I happen to have met because we went to school together. Whereas nowadays you see people quite successfully sustaining very meaningful relationships and friendships with people who are all over the world. And an example that Jerad's often used in the past, he's got friends who are having babies like back home in the States, and he's able to see their children grow up, from his life here in London, in an incredibly efficient way that we can't really replicate currently in our working lives. We heard many people say to us at the moment they step into the reinsurance world, and it is like getting into a time machine where the only means of communicating or finding people are at best old-fashioned. So we're there to try and inject that same familiarity of modern digital relationships into the workspace as well.
It's such an important part of our product. We've actually embedded it as sort of the third pillar of what we do. Is every user of our platform builds their own profile and articulates their appetite in line of business and geography to help better connect those counterparts from around the world. When I first joined the industry on the broking side with Aon, we'd get a new deal and we wanted to find an underwriter for a certain class of business. It was reliant on, did the more senior members of the team have that person written down or stored somewhere? There was no efficient mechanism by which you knew who wanted to write what. And in much the same way of like an analog address book or contact book works, if you've decided you want to write different types of business or grow into a new geography, no one in your worldwide market knows that yet. And there's no efficient mechanism to get everyone updated as to you want to do something new or expand into a new area. And as we lean into digitizing this experience, elevating what people can know about each other as it pertains to deals and working together, we've very much embedded that personal and human component into the core of what we do.
So many people listening to this who are maybe involved in insurance, maybe the more traditional components of like primaries, like direct to customer insurance, may not be aware of the sort of the nuances of the reinsurance world, because it is a bit of a different beast in many ways. So when I hear you talking about, what do people not really understand then about the way historically reinsurance has been done and this process takes place that might help us understand a little bit about why this is such an interesting thing to do?
Yeah, it's really a fascinating process, because you have the who guards the guardians kind of question, and how does that work? And unless you've been there and experienced it, it's an imaginary place for a lot of people. So happy to give a bit of a peek behind the curtain as to how this typically works. It all starts with an insurance company who is looking to, for a variety of reasons, whether it's for their solvency to ensure that their results avoid volatility, to protect them from large catastrophes or major events that could impact their earnings, all sorts of reasons, an insurance company wants to get reinsurance coverage. And in order to do so, they have to make a pitch to the market, effectively, to say, this is why you should reinsure us of all the other insurance companies out there. And so begins a process for them of effectively explaining what on earth it is that they do as an insurance company, and why they do it well, and where they do it and how they do it, with a means of being able to show those reinsurance companies that if they form a relationship with the insurer, it's going to be positive for them both in the long run. In the earliest sort of versions of this, it was very much based on trust and relationships, as we said. So there would be quite a limited amount of data available to interrogate as a reinsurer was assessing, do I want to get into bed with this insurance company and form a long-term relationship? It would be very much people that drove the trust there as to who would reinsure who. But over time, as we've had much more data become available, you've seen quite a standard set of requirements and exhibits that need to be produced to share with the reinsurers to convince them to reinsure them. And what this looks like at scale, especially for the bigger insurance companies, is that they have to produce this huge data pack nowadays, which covers, and what I'm going to say here covers each individual entity and oftentimes each individual product that each individual entity in each country is writing. So they have to do this several times. Some of these insurers are buying 30, 40 different reinsurance policies, and each policy will need a different pack put together for each section of business that it's writing. And inside this data pack, what they have to put together is a sort of historical and forward-looking view of a number of things. So the premiums that they have been writing and expect to continue writing, the rate changes that they expect to see over time. What are they going to be able to charge for the policies that they've been writing in that space? A general listing and bordereau of all the policies that they've been writing and how they differ in different respects, such as the limits and the deductibles that are involved in those policies. So you see these 2D tables and profiles being built out. And then there's a huge focus on the claims side, of course, as well. So loss runs showing the claims that are coming in new, the claims that are developing, and triangles showing how those are performing over time. And nobody seems to know that that process exists, which is why we're so excited to be helping out there, in particular with our Supercede analytics tool, because at the moment preparing all of that data in a reliable way is really, really hard. It takes some seeded re-teams up to sort of 3 months to get one pack ready for their big treaties where they've got, multi-class, multi-section coverages that they have to somehow explain by reaching out to about 10 different actuaries and 20 different underwriters and reserving teams and MI teams to try and get a roughly reliable Excel spreadsheet set together. And then that's where their process should end. They've managed to get all their data together internally and they pass it off to the broker. And the broker at this point hopes to come in and say, great, we can take a look at your data. And based on your data, we're going to tell you what the best coverage you can buy is, who the best people to buy it from will be, and how you structure a deal around, your profile that's going to work for you and give you the best protection. But what's actually happening at the moment instead is that instead of spending 90% of its time on that problem as a broker, the broker's stuck spending 90% of their time sorting out that data again. Because the broker, when they start reviewing all of these exhibits that have come together, they spot little mistakes, they spot inconsistencies based on what was shared last year, and they have to go back to the cedent. And they go back to the insurance company, who in turn has to go back to those 20 underwriters, those 10 actuaries, the reserving teams, to try and find out why something doesn't line up. And it just creates this tremendous back and forth, which is exacerbated, again, as you'd expect, when it goes to the reinsurers, who in turn do their own analysis and spot even more things and have more questions. And so there's this real huge amount of work that's created just by trying to get the data that's needed for the reinsurers to decide who they're going to reinsure. That process there has been untouched, I think, since the data started to be added into the sort of who do we trust question. And we haven't yet, as an industry, reached a point where that could be systematized in some way, so that there was an easy way for insurers to present that data to reinsurers in a consistent way, and to present it to their brokers so that their brokers spend their time actually adding value and not just cleaning data. And that's where Supercede Analytics is coming in at the moment, to offer that validation, cleansing, and automation solution that means you can basically allocate to all the different individuals, those underwriters, those actuaries, a very convenient online portal to drop in their data. They get instant feedback on what they're providing, to compare it against last year, to also check that there aren't any obvious errors and mistakes and things in there, made up currency symbols or missing columns, or the fact that you've only submitted 300 rows data when last year you submitted 3,000, all sorts of things we see all the time. And so that means that process that normally takes 3 months can be done in 3 days, which is a huge jump forwards. It means suddenly you can actually start to do something with that data and start to make far better decisions about your reinsurance buying.
This is my point. I hear all of that, and thank you for the long explanation. And it's a complicated process, and many people won't know that this is taking place, but it's working at the moment. So why does it matter? What does it do by doing all the things we've just talked about, automating it, creating the data, and making it more transmissible? How does that help your average person on the street who may not even know about all this? Why does it matter?
Yeah, this is a fundamental importance of where reinsurance sits and how what it's intended to support. And when you look at the inefficiencies throughout the entire insurance ecosystem, constraints around how the insurance companies can access capital and get protection for their additional risks trickles down through the process. In much the same way, if you're a young driver and your premium is incredibly expensive, your inability, the insurance company's inability to get efficient support and protection results in them having to hold additional capital on their balance sheet and a variety of other challenges that they face. which then trickle down to the end consumer. So improving the ability for the insurance companies to get additional protection, additional coverage, allows the insurance companies themselves to deliver more innovation, more efficient pricing, better solutions to their end clients. One of the things that we think is really, really interesting is the innovation that's happening on the direct-to-consumer side, the introduction of new products and helping to close coverage gaps and these types of things. And the ability for the insurance companies to actually do that is reliant in a lot of ways of them getting really efficient access to reinsurance support to do so. In much the same way that, if we free up a bit of additional cash on our side because of how we buy our own homeowners insurance, it means you don't need to have, several $100,000 in cash to buy yourself a new house. You can, you have your insurance in place and you can deploy your assets and things in other more efficient ways. Insurance operates in a very similar way with their relationship to the reinsurance market. So one of the things that we're most excited about is as we improve the ability for the insurance companies to efficiently structure and source reinsurance capacity, that innovation and that value will trickle down through greater innovation to the end consumer and ultimately probably better pricing and things as well.
And so we've got this kind of efficiency process. We've got this then trickle down to the consumer, which hopefully then starts to breed innovation around products and allows insurers to do more of the work focusing on the coverage gaps and price dislocation, big topic. And I've had other guests on the show from Kettle and others and Descartes talking about kind of climate change and wildfire. So is it the data here that really, because you talked about there for a minute, Ben, you said that is it the data that enables that, and how do you use that data?
Yeah, I think the data is key in a number of ways. Firstly, because at the moment, as we said, the efficiency challenge around getting to the data is so large that, Jerad is sat at Lloyd's at the moment. They're running at a 38% expense ratio at the moment. So the consumer's suffering, the fact that almost, 4/10 or 2/5 of the pile of money available to pay their claims is already gone by the time it's ready to, be used, just spent on expenses. So firstly, we've absolutely got to take out that process, and so much of that is due to just data needing to get sorted. But then once you have the data, once you actually have the visibility around how portfolios are performing and the ability to consider how they are together forming a diversified portfolio for an insurance company in the first instance, but for a reinsurance company afterwards, it enables us to move closer towards, I guess this is sort of a nirvana in the reinsurance world, where you have a much more diversified portfolio because you're actually understanding what's in your portfolio. So you understand your cost of capital, you understand the ability to play off different portfolios against each other more when you understand what is actually inside those portfolios. Whereas at the moment, there's a huge bulk of the capital that's held by reinsurance companies is just held for uncertainty because they don't know what they've actually insured and insured again, if that makes sense. They just have this huge unknown. So there's a big pile of cash that just sits there doing nothing that instead could be deployed much more efficiently if they were able to know what was actually going through their portfolios. And likewise for the insurers as well. You'd be surprised in general how difficult it is for an insurance company, especially these big firms that have grown through mergers and acquisitions and are using different systems in every country, to actually get that portfolio view, that reinsurer's perspective on what they're doing overall and what their sort of overall portfolio looks like, and escalating that view to the point where you have a consistent view of here's all of the business that's coming in and here's all the business that we're taking out, and this is the balance that we're left with as a business. Being able to make effective decisions on that enables you to be braver, and it enables you to actually think about which portfolios you want to bring into the business and which portfolios you want to address with some actual knowledge. Whereas at the moment, it's sort of every individual underwriting team's business case to make to management that what they're doing is a good job. But it's very hard for the senior folks in the business to actually tell how the business is performing across the board until many years later, when it's a bit too late.
I mean, I think we could probably talk for a long time about the opportunity for innovation and transformation and the sort of the idiosyncratic nature of reinsurance. And maybe we can come back to that and themes like blockchain and parametrics and how that then connects to these huge events that we've been seeing in the world, like with the pandemic and climate change and such. But we'll just park that for a moment, because one of the reasons I really wanted to talk to you both is because of the idea of the ecosystem. And I think it's really exciting that you're trying to do something so big within a 500 billion market. You're looking to create a brand new ecosystem. And I think many insurers, many new startups are all very interested in this idea of an ecosystem and how they can create it and capture value. But it's a big challenge. It's hard to do. Many have come, many have failed. And I mean, I'm hats off to you in terms of taking on this challenge. So I suppose I'd just like to stop there for a moment and just ask you some of your lessons that you've learned so far. You know, you come from insurance, both of you, and now you're taking on this challenge around an ecosystem. So yeah, what have you learned so far in the journey from Riskbook to Supercede in creating an ecosystem and how you make it work?
Yeah, it's a really good question. When we thought about the original sort of step, I think we always had a shared bigger vision of, from the various first conversations Ben and I had around what this might become, we always sort of carried it through and, then this could happen, that could unlock this, and then these things could be possible. And we always recognized the various stages that we thought things would have to go through. You can't get to this endpoint without these intermediate steps. And we've been working backwards to identify what the most impactful intermediate steps are. I think the industry collectively, when you talk about the future of the space, there's this shared agreement of what nirvana looks like. I think the really hard thing is, how do you get to that end state? What does that look like? For us, some of the biggest learnings that we've had, and we've been very fortunate really early on, is getting feedback from our users and talking to the industry around what they want and why. We've seen a number of startups who come from the outside and they sort of proceed to present their position to the market, and they sort of try to force the market to adopt their view of the future. And we've been very engaged early on with our earliest ideas and getting feedback from practitioners and users. Ben mentioned the networking under 35s and under 40s, like reinsurance groups. What do those individuals think about the future? What is the future that they want to experience? And where do they see it evolving? Because it doesn't make sense for us to go away and build some sort of monolithic beast and then sort of force everyone to try to adopt it and then try to drag everyone through it. The reason we're getting so much pull for our solution is because we're listening so closely to what people are talking about and the pain points that they have, right? And it's some of these things, they don't jump out at you. The challenges around data preparation that Ben took us through isn't sort of presented as part of the Blueprint 2 initiative of placement data preparation is too burdensome, right? That emerged from us talking to users and them saying, we see this evolution of moving towards electronic transactions, but we have this huge pain point of zip files full of spreadsheets that we can't get out of. And it was digging into that and uncovering what's happening there that resulted in us building solutions to tackle that. And we're so engaged with our early users and our community around what are the things that will help them grow as individuals, grow as businesses, and we're building solutions that help them meet those needs. The other thing that we think about from an ecosystem play is understanding that a truly successful ecosystem supports a huge diversity of players and all who have their own specific needs. And there's certain things that no one's doing well that we want to definitely build and deliver to the market. But there's other things that, there's amazing solutions that are already out there. You look at the CAP modeling solutions that AIR and RMS have and what Oasis is doing around innovating in that space. Back office solutions like Trace ISIS, Open Twin system. There's these systems that are really robust that solve the needs of various players. And, and as we look at a diversifying group of individuals, the needs of a Nafila will look very, very different than the needs of an AXA XL or an Amlin. And so what we want to do is not sort of force them to all adopt a singular model, but bring certain elements of that in through a standardized flow, the trade itself, the underlying data, but then allowing them to connect in things that will help their business be more efficient, a capital model, so, tool or similar. And so as we build this ecosystem, it's recognizing the need for interconnectivity, the ability for data to come in and out of our system so that those individuals are getting the information that drives their decision making in a really efficient way, but recognizing that the tools they use to do that might differ radically across parties, and us not trying to impose the way to do it to them, but rather present elements that should be improved upon, moving us away from emails and spreadsheets into digitizing that more generally, but then passing that along in a variety of ways to people who want to ingest it in a variety of ways and analyze it in their own view of the world.
I think it was Charlie Munger who said, if people can work based on incentives, then they should work in no other way. I may have bastardized that a little bit, but I think the essence is this idea that incentives are so important. And I hear that in a new ecosystem, or in actually, let's take the nature model, in any ecosystem, there's a set of incentives for organisms and participants to act, and that can be usually on the free exchange of energy, the protection of energy, the acquisition of energy, and they have a range of strategies that they employ to go about growing, recreating, and propagating. So I wonder how important incentives are to you guys when you're trying to change behavior, maybe trying to bring people into the system, and how you think about that.
Yeah, it's a really exciting question, and one we think about all the time, because I think we'd seen from our analysis of a lot of other solutions and attempts to build ecosystems in the past that certain things were not possible. For example, this valiant but unfortunately kind of doomed belief that there was a greater good for insurance industry participants to create some magical new technology future together. That doesn't have the incentives that are required. People are not willing, when it gets down to the actual practitioners who have to change their way of working, and to the firms that have to manage their own competitive stance, etc. This idea that we should all adopt technology for the greater good of the industry, that hasn't really worked any of the times that it's been tried. You have to find, in some ways, and again, this is our invisible hand or whatever you want to call it, you have to find the selfish parts that also work towards the greater good. So how do we help the individual practitioners, the individual users, to make their own lives better, so that if you're the person who's responsible for actually bringing the data into the ecosystem on the ground, you're not doing it because it will make your boss or your boss's boss or someone you've never met's life easier, or some startup who's got an exciting vision come true, because you probably don't care. You've got to do it because you get something back, and it's going to genuinely make your working life better. It's going to give you new insights that you didn't think you could get before. And that has been critical to us sort of from the beginning, to work out through these interviews that we keep mentioning, and through our own experiences, through the people in the team that we've brought on. That has been the most critical learning for us, I think, there, that we've got to actually respond to not just a firm's incentives, but the individual people who work there's incentives, to give them a real reason to adopt our solution. I think you saw a really nice comparable example with OpenTable, for example. We quite like as an example, where when they were kickstarting their business for booking.
And forget, people listening, OpenTable is where you can book restaurants, right? If I'm getting this right. Back when we actually used to book restaurants, if I remember that now. Yeah, that was a long time ago, right?
Indeed. Yeah. So OpenTable, we know as consumers in that angle of, we did know, as you say, that angle of being able to book restaurants. online, and it was great. And it meant that OpenTable could join up all of the people who wanted to book restaurants with all the restaurants who were looking. But until there were any people booking restaurants on there was no reason for restaurants to sign up, because the restaurants would say to OpenTable, yeah, we'll sign up and put our restaurant on there once you've got loads of people waiting to book restaurants. And the people who wanted to book restaurants were saying, yeah, we'll sign up and book restaurants once you've got all of the restaurants signed up. And so you end up with this classic chicken and egg problem around a marketplace, where at some point you've got to have a selfish, self-contained interest that means that, and I'm using selfish in the most positive way here. Sorry, it sounds like a bad word, but sometimes we've got
no, absolutely. Yeah, The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins. Read that if you want to know about its sufficiency. Yeah, so yeah.
But effectively, yeah. So OpenTable had to find a way to convince one of these groups that this is where they wanted to be. They wanted to join the ecosystem, even if none of those diners would ever sign up to the app. You had to get people to join the ecosystem without any dependency on anybody else. And so what they did was they introduced a table management software for restaurants. So the restaurants themselves, who currently had this big organization issue of, if somebody calls and books a table and they've got some 2-seater tables, some 4-seater tables, some 6-seater tables, they might have built something themselves using, I don't know, Microsoft Visio. I don't even know if that's the right one, or they've got like a PDF diagram and they've numbered all the tables. They didn't have anything clever here to make that allocation of tables smart. Whereas OpenTable said, look, we'll help you with your table allocation and managing, how many bookings you can take and which tables people can go to, regardless of whether those bookings are coming via OpenTable. We'll give you that software. And the restaurants were delighted and they all signed up, and suddenly OpenTable had this critical mass of restaurants that meant they could go to the diners and say, oh no, we've got some pretty good restaurants on here, you should get involved. And I think we have to create the same effect to enable ecosystems in insurance more generally, but in the reinsurance space particularly, where we're bringing on the cedents, the brokers, the reinsurers, because they get value themselves without any dependency on anybody else being there. You see this most strongly, I think, with our analytics solution, where a cedent is able to actually organize for the first time all of their outwards portfolio data and understand much more deeply their inwards data in the process by going through that exercise of bringing it together and seeing it all in one place. And they want to do that regardless of whether their broker then uses Supercede placements or their underwriter finds them via the Supercede network. And then similarly, we see the same sort of thing happening now with the brokers as well. We've just introduced, so on Supercede placements, we have a Lloyd's recognized e-placement platform built just for reinsurance globally. On that system as well, we've introduced a feature called Ghostwriter, which is a great name, I personally feel. But it basically solves for this issue that if you've only got, let's say you've got 10 underwriters on a deal that you're trying to place, and 9 of them are on Supercede, and underwriter number 10 is like, we don't like new technology, we like doing things via email, or we like to send our slip in the post or our authorization via Telegram, or who knows. And I mean old-fashioned Telegram, not the WhatsApp alternative. If you're stuck in that kind of scenario, we needed to give the brokers a way where this was actually just going to be a much easier way to track your deals and all the underwriters on them, regardless of whether those underwriters are also signed up. And so Ghostwriter lets you manage and add evidence to all of these authorizations and quotes that you're receiving that you currently don't have any way of tracking. What you have instead is a broker running around with Excel trackers and emails that they're trying to file somewhere that are their evidence that somebody actually has authorized on a deal, which makes things very complicated otherwise. So again, making a system that individual placing broker gets value from, even if none of their friends turn up. It has to be the way you do things initially, so that eventually you can go to everybody else and say, we've got a critical mass now, so now it's valuable for you too.
So you're incentivizing them with making their life easier. It's like the little pollen hit that the bee gets for landing in the flower and generating the pollination process. It's
I can sort of hear in that you're trying to sort of focus on those. What are the things that those actors need? And you mentioned it earlier with you about these interviews. I kind of want to go back to the feedback sessions. I don't know why I'm sort of interested in those so much, but I'd like to know, is there something you're doing in there? Is that something that you have worked hard on in terms of the feedback sessions? Are you trying to standardize that process? Yeah. How do you get sort of information from your pollinators? if I torture that metaphor.
Yeah, I think for us, it starts with, and I think this is where a lot of startups struggle, is your default position as a startup is to come in and when you engage with someone from the market or a potential user, is to start by telling them how awesome your thing is and selling them right out of the gates of, this is what we do and we'll help you do this and this is how amazing this thing will be to your life, etc. And we've taken almost the exact opposite approach. We've gone in pure discovery mode and started conversation around, like, when you're going through this super painful time. So in reinsurance, it's called renewal season. There's only a handful of times throughout the year that all reinsurance gets placed. So it's exceptionally busy for everybody. And we go in with questions like, during this time, when you're in the office from 8 a.m. till 10 p.m., doing it, for weeks and weeks on end, what are the most painful parts? And then they, start telling, oh, I have to do this. Like, well, why do you do it that way? Oh, because I have to go back and do this. And you just keep discovering, right? And we're not there to say, oh, so Supercede, voila, magic pill. What we're instead doing is discovering and learning and capturing a whole suite of these experiences. Because you don't solve these pain points for users with solutions directly, right? They're not coming to you to buy a tool. They're coming to solve a pain point, or they're coming to solve a need or fix a need that they have. And only through this sort of just digging and digging and digging, do you start to uncover the root causes of these issues. And going back to the analytics solution that we have, it started from the reinsurers saying, we have this problem. We get just zip files full of spreadsheets, and every broker's spreadsheets look very different, and they're never organized in the same way. There's loads of errors in those. And it was only through really digging with brokers and carriers, insurers, that we started to understand why that was the case, why this is so hard and so painful to put together, and really leaning into, so once you've done this, then you have all these issues like, okay, that makes sense. I see why that's hard. And then what are you trying to do next? Well, then we have to compare it to last year's. And we had a really big issue last year because, Jenny, who created last year's pack, moved on to another role at a different company. So we actually don't know exactly how she prepared a couple of these exhibits. So we're sort of really stuck trying to align with what we've done and cross-checking with what we think she may have done and sense-checking where those numbers are. And it's so hard to do that efficiently. And it was us like really digging there. It's like, oh, so there's this real pain of not knowing exactly how it came together. And all of these kind of, this discovery process that we take on with clients results in how we build our solutions and what pain points we're trying to tackle. And again, the reason why it's resonating so much with the industry, because now when we go into client calls now, and again, very discovery focused early on, what are the pain points that you have? What does your process currently look like? It feels and sounds very, very familiar because we've done so much of this discovery. So when we start talking about what we're doing and where we think it might be able to help, it's based on the fact that we've understood that conversation a huge amount of times previously. So it's these kind of things. And I think it's very counterintuitive for startups. A lot of times I think you're so excited to talk about the thing you're going to use to change the world. But most people, they don't, they're not looking for you to change the world. They're looking for their own pain to be solved. And again, going back to Ben's selfish need, like as a junior broker, even a senior broker, like my ambition to change the industry is relatively low, but my ambition to not be in the office till 10 p.m. at night, in advance of my anniversary or a child's birthday, or like that's super high. If you can find or deliver me a way that I can be home in time for dinner with my family, I am very, very interested in that. And I'm a bit less interested in the transforming the industry and like the greater good of everyone.
Yeah, I'm left thinking about that. I had a previous guest is Thomas Weddelsborg. He wrote a book called "What's Your Problem?" And I mean, the opening title of the book is "To Solve Your Toughest Problems, Change the Problems You Solve." And I think so often we go into problem-solving mode straight away into action without actually thinking, are we trying to solve the issue? And he is a great example of a lift, of a elevator, and the elevator problem. And you tell a owner of a building that the elevators, the residents are saying that the elevator is too slow. So they think, what do? We speed it up, right? Everybody goes, so let's speed that elevator up, let's make it faster. Well, as many experienced building managers will tell you, all you need to do is put mirrors up to distract the people from the weight, because it's not actually the speed of the elevator that's the problem. It's the experience of the weight that's the problem. And what is that going on? And then, so we can sort of like flip that by listening, by thinking, by actually trying to change the conversation a little bit and focus on the right problem. But I was also wondering, listening to that example you've given me, is that, and this will be a link into what I want to go on to talk about, the journey of doing investment and maybe a bit of a meta idea of incentives for yourselves as well. But have you found that to be an easier process of getting this information as a startup and not being a big industry incumbent like the B3I thing, being, Swiss Re, being Munich, being SCOR? Is it just been easier because you guys are just a small new kids on the block, small startup?
I think so. And I think a really important piece to emphasize here is that we were from day one incredibly neutrally minded and fiercely guarded our independence as we went through this process. So you mentioned funding. I think we had this really entertaining time where, just as InsurTech was coming into vogue and all of the different insurers were setting up their own venture funds and things to invest in startups, we were like, yeah, we've seen this happen before. We've seen so many startups sunk by the fact that they took an investment from X big insurer or X big broker, and now nobody wants to talk to them and nobody wants to work with them because they're effectively then going to be, by osmosis, talking to their competition. So we guarded that very carefully so that we could keep our independence. And that, to your point, then meant that we could go in truly neutrally to all of these parties and have a much more frank and interesting discussion about what they were doing, because especially in the early days, they were talking as much to Riskbook as it was, or Supercede now, as they were to Jerad and Ben, two guys who have got a plan, who want to go and change things for the better and take pain out of people's lives. So why would you not want to have a chat with them and try and help them think about how they're going to solve this? I think it helped as well that we'd built up through our sort of most recent roles in various industry firms. So Jerad and myself, before Jerad went to Tiger, were working together for a period at Aon Endpoint, where we were consulting for a huge number of insurers and reinsurers around the market. And afterwards, we were able effectively to go back to all of those firms and say, we did a lot of work for you. We'd love to continue the discussion almost and dive into some of the issues that we know, you might not have wanted to share so explicitly with your big broker partners, because you want to appear strong and perfect to everybody else in the market. But when you actually then can go behind the curtain as like a friendly helper who's hopefully going to solve some things for you, they're much more willing to actually talk about, it looks like a swan on the surface of the water, but underneath the legs are going like crazy. Can you take a look at the legs, please? So that's been helpful.
I do really would love to come back and talk about how you found each other, and the whole journey of finding each other as co-founder. That sounds very romantic, but you work together. But I know it's a very important dynamic, and I've spoken to both of you and also to your CTO as well, and it's interesting the dynamic you all have, and it's very thoughtful people. And I'd love to just talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But before I go there, I'd just like to double click on the funding element, because I think for many people they'll be interested in that, because where are you in the funding process, and how did you guard that? And did it mean you had less options, or what was that process like? So maybe there's many questions in one there, so unpick them as you wish.
Yeah, I think very early on, funding for any startup, that first pass is really, really hard. Unless you're in San Francisco and you just walk around to coffee shops and talk to billionaires who are handing out angel checks. I think for most founders, that first pass is really hard. It was especially challenging for us because, as Ben mentioned, we were very, very committed to not taking venture capital from these sort of like corporate venture firms that the insurance industry had set up. And that was difficult because those were the firms that fundamentally understood what we were doing, right? So now we're trying to educate these non-industry investors what reinsurance is, why it matters, why there's a huge opportunity to do something of import here, and not having the ability to sort of take the easy money from the big institutional industry investors. But we had a number of early angels who backed us. And they're like, you're trying to take on, as you mentioned, the really big, hard problem. And this is super exciting. We want to back that. And then we got some amazing support from Seed Camp and MMC Ventures, who then sort of followed our journey from that early stage. MMC not affiliated with Marsh & McLennan, I think, just again to reiterate the independence angle we have. But, and as we grew, and as the product evolved, and as we were getting traction and client engagement and all these things as the business began to develop, it's made the additional funding process a little bit easier because now you're able to convey what you're actually doing as a business and why it's important, and showing that the clients really want that. So it's getting easier. We're raising our next round this summer, so we've got a lot of exciting momentum there. But it's all part of this sort of journey of going through that. But there's definitely bumps early in the journey.
Well, this is an interesting point for me because I would like to go meta with incentives here, because you both come from the industry. You've been in innovation units, you've been in insurers, where when you're trying to get stuff done inside a big organization, you have an incentive that you may get fired to actually get the stuff done. But you have so much inertia and, this huge pressure from, existing business units who want to maintain the status quo. But you guys now have gone out, you've quit your day jobs, you've got some money together, now you've raised some funds, and that must be putting a different level of pressure on you. This is another level of incentive for you to get this right. So I'd just like to talk about this. Has it been the bed of roses you were expecting? Has it been, a bush of thorns that you were expecting? What has been the process like of creating something as founders? And have you experienced a different level of incentive to make this work?
Yeah, it's incomparable, I would say, on so many levels to a corporate lifestyle, where you can, on one hand, sort of at the lower end, I guess, you can coast along a lot more easily in the corporate world. And at the upper end, you can hit the ceiling really soon in the corporate world as well, because the ambition you have or the visions you have for what your firm could do or what the industry could do aren't gonna, line up with the high level corporate goals of that particular employer, or a bit too much effort for the fifth layer of approvals that it has to go through, or the person in legal and compliance is too busy with something else, and so on. So you very quickly find yourself hitting walls in that corporate environment. But equally, you have this big, safety net underneath you. So you're almost in this sort of narrow tunnel of safety, I guess. When you go into the startup world, the ceiling disappears, which is amazing, but the bottom drops out as well, and the floor is no longer the limit in some ways too. So you end up with this huge freedom to succeed, but also this huge freedom to fail. And I think it was one of the various people have probably said it, but this idea that you're constantly tightrope walking between immense success and total failure, and it very much feels like that as you go along. But certainly, I think the freedom that you have then to really focus on what you're trying to achieve, and to push away anything else, any of the usual, day job stuff or bureaucracy that might come from being part of a large organization that, rightly has bureaucracy because it has so many other things that it has to worry about. You get this ability to just focus on the mission critical and really run at the goal that you're trying to achieve. And that focus also comes with the pressure as well, because you only have one goal. It's quite hard to escape from it. You can't create some other mysterious metric for yourself about how you're doing. It's very clear whether you're achieving your goal or not. And you do have a lot of pressure from, especially as the brand grows and more people learn about what we're doing, we do have a lot of pressure to deliver on our goals. But I think one of the most acute feelings of pressure definitely comes from the fact that we have other people's money to spend on building this vision. And it's very easy, I think, for some people to sometimes comment, on like, oh, startups, they just go out and spend other people's money. Certainly, I think there are cases where that can be true. If you look at some crazy funding rounds that happen and they spend them all on pinball machines and things for their offices. But when you're, as in our case, taking early angel investment from your friends and from your colleagues and from your mentors around the industry, and they're giving, and in many cases, in our case, when we first set out, these weren't, people with tons of money to burn. They were people who, made a special enablement out of their own savings to support us. That brings with us huge pressure when you look at every expenditure you can make, and you have to really think about, is this the best use of the money that we've been entrusted by X person who really trusts us and who we, really trust as well. And then you go through a funding round, and then suddenly everything scales up again. You realize, wait a minute, our last funding round was £2 million. And now we're employing, I think starting Monday, we'll be employing 18 people as a company. And that brings a pressure, not only in terms of delivering the results and making sure we do what's required to ensure that we can continue to pay those 18 people, but we're enabling people's lives. So each of the people who work as part of the Supercede ecosystem, many of them have been able to move homes or start sort of new chapters of their own lives with the security that a job at Supercede has given them. So that's something as well that you really can't take lightly. But at the same time,
great human incentives there, isn't there? Some wonderful.
So many people depending on you, right? In many ways, which I think means that you end up in a sort of a roller coaster mode that you learn to ride quite well, which is like your downs on the roller coaster are much lower than in the corporate world, but the highs are so much greater as well. So it's sort of this constant, celebration and panic and everything in between that you get a thick skin to quite quickly. I would say, I think, from the early days, panicking about whether a remaining, 25K check was going to come into the angel round versus nowadays thinking about much bigger things. You get used to the roller coaster after a while, and I think you learn to ride it and to make sure that you're steering well as well.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And I do love to ask this question in some ways. And it was David Soloff, who is a 3-time founder who was on my show previously, and said that startups is the only industry like you feel like you're on top of the world in the morning and you want to shoot yourself in the face in the afternoon. So I can, I kind of have a feeling myself. I know experiencing it when it's your own money and you're employing people, it does bring just another level of intensity to the whole mission, and not necessarily a bad thing. So we all need incentives, as we've probably already absolutely agreed upon. I would just like to sort of talk about something else though for a quick moment between the two of you. So, we talked about, I came back to earlier about the relationship between the two of you and the incentives to make all this work. And how do you two make it work? And there's Jason as well. I'm going to talk to Jason, who's your CTO, on another show, because I really want to talk to him about some of the other setups you have in the firm with distributed working, the technology platform, how you get that done. But for now, I would like to talk to the two of you. How do you deal with disagreements? How do you deal with cooperation, feedback, success, failure? Talk me through the co-founder dynamic.
Yeah, I think it's a real testament to where the journey began, and I think it's reflective of us, the process by which we started this. So the earliest ideas sort of originated from some project work, like on a side thing that Ben had done at Lloyd's. And we started talking about what we thought the industry could do. And it all was very, for a long time, theoretical. And it was us sort of bouncing ideas of like, oh, this could do this. And it would eventually do this. And I think our default position was that there wasn't anything to do there. There wasn't a business, wasn't a company. It wasn't like day one, let's build a company together. It was this shared discovery and like thought experiment in a lot of ways of where we thought the industry would go and how it might work and what it might look like. And then the more we kept digging into it and the more we started doing this process where it was, but let's look at all the ways that this doesn't work at all. And almost like, let's find ways to just keep our really secure corporate trajectory jobs and stay with this. And slowly, as we kept finding and talking about the various things and thinking through reasons that it shouldn't work, but found other reasons that if we approached differently, it could or would. And eventually came to the point where we felt obligated to do it. It was like we felt we had a good shot at it. We looked at all the reasons we thought historically that it hadn't worked, the ecosystem hadn't come together, and why. And we both shared the belief that it would happen during our career. And we felt that the ways we had thought through it made a lot of sense. And we felt compelled to do it. But I think part of that foundational journey, which was over a year and a half, 2 years of sort of from the earliest conversations to us sort of going out and starting, quitting our jobs and doing this, was as we built our relationship, both as friends, but also as people who, shared interesting ideas. And we built a huge amount of trust and confidence in the way they thought about problems. And even now as we have, things that will come up where our default position might be quite polar opposites from each other, we both have this inherent sense of, but I really need to understand what the other person's perspective is and why they came to that conclusion, because there's not this dismissing of that. It's sort of this, we've always gone through this idea bouncing off each other sort of model. And the end result has always been a better, more crystallized version of an idea. And, we continue to do that all the time now. There's loads of stuff that we do where it's like, here's early idea one, and we then iterate on it together and work through it. And I think with that, there's very little, and this is one of our core sort of themes and culture traits that we look for, but a huge amount of humility. Like there isn't a sense of that was my idea and therefore we should prioritize that. Like there's always this, what is the best idea? And regardless of where that comes from, there's this like ruthless willingness to get to the better version of that idea. And there's not a like, and I think at the end, it's very common that we don't know what the original idea was or who, seeded it. It's like something came up, we began to discuss it, and it evolved and matured. And then at a certain point, we have this amazing thing that we want to go do. And the journey of like forming that, there's no sense of like, well, I thought of this first, or that was my additional contribution. There's just this sense of reaching towards that greater position. And so, as we go through and we disagree on different things or in different positions on how we think through it, we've built over the last several years, I think, a fabulous mechanism by which we very organically collaborate and work towards what we want to get to as a business. And I think it's proven itself very sort of fruitful as we've grown.
Well, I love to hear those types of words be used in the structure of teams. And this podcast is called Talent Equals. I spent my 20 years recruiting people and building teams. And so I kind of like this. So I'm going to get into my wheelhouse here for a moment. This is where I'd like to talk to you. You use the word trust, confidence, humility. I asked you the question about what it's like to solve problems, meeting each other, figuring out. So I wonder, have you come to learn, like, are there any specific values that you really look for now when you're hiring people?
Yeah, absolutely. We have some crystallized values. It was really funny, and I think I'll touch on a couple of things once here. I just wanted to briefly add to Jerad's previous story that listeners need to imagine most of those conversations Jerad was describing as being outdoors whilst Jerad trained me for my first marathon and his 10th, which I think is an important thing to overlay. We had plenty
so he took you out and got you knackered and then beat you down, right? Okay, I like that, Jerad. That's a brilliant strategy.
But yeah, and again, I think these things are really important, right? Because you can otherwise imagine these conversations happening in all sorts of different contexts. And some other contexts that I just want to overlay into this conversation. The fact that Jerad in particular is like a voracious, like huge reader of startup and more general culture and all sorts of narratives that are very forward-thinking and thoughtful about how you manage a company and how you think about building businesses. So I'm surprised if I ever find a book that Jerad hasn't read in the startup space. So from really early in our journey, I think even when we had, there were 4 of us, I think we already had a culture deck and we already had the values that Supercede wanted to have. As a business.
I love that. I love hearing that.
4 of us, right, which was mad. It was a bit like, well, okay, we'll make sure we don't start a fight between the 4 of us. But really, from the earliest days, I think we built these values. And
can I before you go on that, because no, that's great, Jerad. I'm glad to know that you were involved in that, Ben, because I think this is something that's undervalued. That so many people go along to their funding rounds talking about their mission and what they're going to do, but don't often talk about the culture that they're going to build. Because let's face it, like maybe 80% of that money that they give you is going to go on wages. I mean, it's going to be onto the developers, onto the salespeople, to your wages, right? So why wouldn't we be focusing on the human machine that you're creating? Because everything starts and finishes with people in this business, right? We create the technology, they create the technology, they execute the teams. It's all about the team and the people. So did you pitch the culture early on? Was that something you were talking to investors about?
Early on with investors, we talked about why we were building a remote culture, which was allowing us to have access to a huge array of talent from around the world. As we built, even the earliest days, we knew this was a global business from launch. It wasn't going to be local and then slowly expand. We knew that it had to be support global business from the word go. And building a global team and a distributed team was an element of that. So we talked a lot about accessing the best talent from around the world, regardless of geography. And, we found some, our first engineer was in Singapore when we brought him on, and he moved back home to St. Petersburg. Shortly thereafter, we found some amazing people who were in Canada who've since moved back to Italy, who and we have this sense of we want to find the best people for us, regardless. And there shouldn't be within this, square mile of London, or, there's little pockets in the US. We think there's so much talent that we can access. We had an idea of what we wanted our culture to stand for. And I think it has to be something that companies come to. So we put together the first version around sort of our bigger sort of points that what it meant to work for us, and how we would approach culture as a business. But we did our first sort of team offsite in Belgrade in end of 2019. And part of that week, we split the whole team comes out for a week, spend a week in person doing a number of team building activities and Ask Me Anything sessions and planning and strategy and everything. And we spent a good chunk of that week in culture sessions. And it wasn't us sort of saying, this is what we're doing, but we're talking about, what does it mean to be here? What does a safe work environment mean for you? What does culture mean to us and you as individuals and us as a team collectively? And, one of the challenges that we have with a truly global team is culture is harder to get right. It's very easy when everyone's from Silicon Valley and you have like the hyper liberal ethos that sort of fits in this world. And, but when you have a truly global team with different language barriers, different approaches to how they communicate disagreements and how they give feedback and, their sensitivities around various things. Building a really, really good, thriving culture in that environment requires more effort and more energy. And I think we've benefited from having some commitment to culture early on, because it's much more complex than it is when you have a relatively homogenous group of colleagues, who sit in a little bubble, where culture is, oh, here's our, the percentage of individuals who fit in diversity camp X or Y, and therefore culture, right? It's much, much more nuanced and complex than that. And it's something we talk about constantly. We evaluate our performance. We get feedback from the team on how we're doing there. And it's something that's really important for us to continue to spend time and invest in.
It is hard. I'm glad you said that. I think people maybe I think that's why people don't do it much, or they don't spend enough time on it. Embedding cultural. Maybe I'll go to values. The idea of values. You said I know this. You've got a international team, and people are distributed, and Supercede is distributed, and maybe we can talk a little bit about that in a moment. But you talked about trust and humility, and I actually think those are two very, very important words for community. Trust being the foundation of community is why I also look for integrity in people. I don't care where you are in the world, where you are on a personality spectrum, whatever it is, you need to have trust in your colleagues. You need to have trust in the people around you. And once you can create that environment, then everything else can be built from that. And, humility, I love that, because the humility for me is that idea of, recognizing that there is a bigger mission than yourself. And for teams to succeed, humility and being able to give up your position for the greater good is another key indicator for me of the potential of an organization and a team to go on and do great things. And that's why such humility as well. So those two things, I'm very glad you focused on those. And I feel like maybe we could talk a lot about that, but I'm sure that must be something you focus on a lot, and creating that and engendering that. But in a distributed way, that's tough. That's really tough.
Yeah, and we have to give so much credit here to Jason, who I know you're going to speak with separately, for challenging our, as we often joke, almost Office Space, the film derived kind of work experiences to date. So Jerad and I were coming obviously from a very corporate background, where a lot of the lip service that's paid to these things is almost taken for granted, and that's as far as you extend it. But the experience of working in a remote team wasn't something that Jerad and I had before. The experience of building trusting relationships with people that you had never met in person wasn't something that we had before. And I appreciate something that we've all had to do now, given how the last year has panned out. But we're at a point now where, because we haven't been able to do our offsites in person, I think now the majority of the team we probably haven't met in person, which is astonishing when you think about it. But at the same time, the people in the team, I think among them are some of my closest collaborators and friends in many ways, even though we don't spend time physically together. And culture comes from almost a more deliberate set of interactions than casual water cooler conversation. It's not sort of like the drinks after work sort of thing. You have to make more effort, and you have to think about how you talk to people and think about how you write to people, knowing that there are going to be various interpretations of the things you say. The effort is very easy to see in terms of how you position things and how you challenge your colleagues to think about things differently, and how you listen to feedback and give feedback. We've certainly worked hard on trying to bring in the best practices there. We listen very carefully to people far wiser than us. So our various investors have been incredible, especially the institutions, so Seed Camp and MMC and Ep.7, in connecting us with specialist people, advisors and culture advisors who have seen it all go wrong in startups and have seen it go right in startups, and can be a sounding board for us when we say, we're noticing things drifting a little bit to the right here. How do we drift them back in, or is that okay? And just getting as much input that we can listen to and take on board as we go through very rapid growth with very different people from all over the world.
That's wonderful. And I had my previous guest, Sheila Heen, talk about feedback, and she's a wonderful practitioner in the idea of feedback. And I think it's one of those just skills, life skills. I mean, not only for the good of your organization, but the good of your relationships with friends and loved ones and everything. Feedback and is at that heart of it, really. And we talked about Jason. He's your drummer, CTO, a very lovely guy, and I'm really looking forward to getting him on the show. And I think I'm going to be really deep diving into a bit more with him about your distributed setup. And for listeners who are going to be interested in that, they can stay tuned for that episode where I'm going to talk with Jason about the whole idea of having a very distributed setup and his experience. And you guys have really lived that, truthfully, what you're talking about, and being open to other types of people as well, because I think he comes from a non-traditional background through into technology, and I thought he was a fascinating character. So yeah, stay tuned for that one. Mindful of time, I suppose I'd just like to sort of and finish up talking a little bit about well-being and resilience, and then some of your influences as well, because we are in a weird time. We're in a time where people aren't seeing a lot of each other, a lot of stress, a lot of challenge. So I just sort of wonder how you go about managing the well-being of your team and yourselves, and is this something you guys think about at all? I hope it is, and so maybe you could share a bit about that.
Yeah, we've begun to do more and more of this. I think at a very early stage startup, the amount of commitment people inherently give is amazing, but at the same time, there's always risk of people burning themselves out, and it's something we're paying a lot of attention to now as we grow and we're getting more and more client engagement and we're rushing to build new features. We are recognizing the amount of effort by our team, and we're recognizing as well the impact of COVID more broadly around how disrupting that's been for people's lives. Even though we're a remote team, everyone's kind of had it where it's not log off and go see your family and see your friends and go out for dinners and enjoy life. There's an element of loneliness in a lot of ways that people have sort of had to been dealing with. Certain people have lost family members, and there's a lot of nuance and difficulty.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it comes down to the ability for us as a firm to be, to some extent, a support group for each other. In a way where at the moment, during what's been happening all over the world at different paces and in different waves in different countries, in a way where our families and our friends haven't been able to be there, whilst also ensuring, as Jerad had mentioned, that we don't have people burning out from working too hard with that natural huge enthusiasm that comes from working on something incredibly exciting. I think it is quite easy for people to throw themselves into work and do nothing but work. So we manage that very carefully. One of the interesting things that I think we're trying to do more of at the moment is to make sure that we enable people as much as possible to do their best work and to do it on schedules that suit them and to adapt to what they have going on. So we have a lot of flexible working within the team. So we are an asynchronous team by nature as part of this distributed culture. So if you have unusual arrangements with family, or you need to, as a few colleagues need to randomly fly to a different country to be with loved ones and need to work from there, or are going to be away for a few days, we've been exceptionally open and trusting, I think, there towards what the team does. And how the team manages their own requirements. And I think we've been able to build a huge amount of trust that people are following our values there. So we have one of our key values is being what we call managers of one, or self-governance, effectively. People being able to take their own responsibility for delivering the goals they need to and communicating how they're delivering them back to the rest of the team. And also that means communicating to us when they're going to struggle to meet their goals, and be feeling, that level of trust and the ability to be a bit vulnerable and say, actually, you know what, I need to take 5 days off because things at home aren't great for me. And creating enough trust and a acknowledge that the broader goal of us working together isn't, to make sure that you've clocked in all of the hours you said you would from 9 till 5, but rather that, we're all on this shared mission together. If you've got to take a rest or you've got to do something different for a bit, that's okay, because we trust that you're doing this so that you can come back stronger in 5 days' time. And I think in big corporate machines, that's something that's missing a lot of the time. It's not as easy. There's this automatic distrust. There's this, I think maybe managers have been burned by people who've abused that trust in the past in bigger firms, people who just want to play the game a bit. But I think so far in our culture, we've been small enough, we've been engaged enough, we've been excited enough to trust each other and to go on this journey together in a way where we can really depend on people. And I was reading, interestingly, listening on Audible, as it was, this book called The Art of Fairness by David Bodenis, where he's talking a lot about how do you give to people whilst also auditing, in the sense that, how do we give as many freedoms as we can to people so that they can really run with those responsibilities and those opportunities, but also make sure that we're doing it fairly and making sure that you don't have room for people to take advantage of these things, whilst also you can commit to truly giving them freedoms. I think what classically we've seen is startups have ended up in the longer term disengaging employees because they've thrown too much at them, or they've said, yeah, do whatever you want, work whenever you want, have as many holidays as you want, and it has all sorts of undesired consequences along the way around how different people see their role. So I think people do need some constraints and some ability to check themselves against what's going on with the business. So a big part of what we try to do as founders is to manage that self-governance possibility and to give people as much freedom as they can possibly desire, whilst also giving them enough in the way of constraints and in the way of check-ins and checkpoints and visibilities so that they can feel like they're embracing it in a way that they deserve to. We don't want people to be shy about the fact that if they want to go shopping in the middle of the day because it's better than waiting till the weekend, that's okay. And so we try to be visible as founders as well about how we're using it. So we'll post into the team chat, I'm going to be away for 2 hours now because I need to go and sort something with family, or I'm going to go for my lunchtime run now. See you in an hour. And just making it very visible that this is okay. This kind of stuff is okay. I'm encouraging people to make what they're doing visible as well, so that there's almost that automatic audit, so that people don't, I feel like they have to sneak away from work if they're not going to work, but rather they can embrace it a bit and tell us and be open and share how they're using the fact that we've got a very trusting and open culture.
Yeah. I mean, I hear there's so much meta here about the ecosystem and incentives. You're creating your own ecosystem to be able to create an ecosystem, and you have to have the right incentives within your work environment that people feel so committed to that culture and so committed to the survival of that because it works for them so well that then that's their incentive to make sure the community stays alive. And I think this is something that people misunderstand, I think, about teams. I mean, maybe big corporates, I'm going to generalize here, their incentive is the big salary, maybe in the pension, and they're going to grind you to stay for that, and you get the pension and everything else and the mortgage. But if you're a startup and you've got to compete with those firms where you can't compete on money, maybe you have to just start competing on a trustful environment where the lifestyle is so much better for them. And that is so important that becomes in and of itself the incentives for them to keep the ecosystem alive. And I think trust is at the heart of that. I mean, great teams will tell you that, great sports teams will tell you that you create the wonderful environment for those real superstars to be in, and they won't want to leave. So I think on this one a lot. I can hear it in maybe what you're talking about there, and I think we will explore more about distributed working because I'm a big fan of this myself. It's something I've adopted fully now here at Exige as well. But yet still to this day, I still encounter the same problem that people. I've been distributed pretty much my entire career. I live in Devon in England. I work all over the world, and I've had to been fighting this for so long that you don't need to be right there on the seat with them, to make a success of this. It's absolutely possible.
So we've talked about sort of the culture that you've got going on and helping people manage their well-being there. Maybe, Jerad, you could tell us a bit about personal well-being for you. I mean, you talk about running. Is exercise part of that for you?
Yeah, it absolutely is. I think there's always a time when we need to sort of find time to think and recharge. And I think it's especially hard for founders because, as we've talked about a bit earlier, it's like you live and breathe what you're doing. Like your entire sort of mission now is aligned with what this company is doing and what we're trying to accomplish. And it's very easy for us to sort of overreach and overextend and do too much there. So finding time to have a step back, to go for runs, to clear your mind. And even then, Ben mentioned us holding, trying to be a good example for the team. We've been quite good holding each other accountable to make sure we take time off as things, ramp up and we have different periods, like making sure that, when is the next time you're going to take a few days off? Are you going to sort of properly, detox from work a little bit? And when we're away, Ben always yells at me, like making sure I'm not on Slack and things, because it's so easy to get a ping and be like, oh, I should chime in here. It's like, no, but if I'm on, like, again, trusting the team is doing what's best, right? I have 100% confidence that if I let this conversation go between a number of colleagues, that they'll come to a conclusion that is as good for the team as anything I would have also been involved with, and giving them a bit of freedom and autonomy there. But I think it's really important to make sure you step away from it for a while. And we talked about, I'm working on this idea, this narrative of running a startup is like running a marathon, but not in the go slow, fast versus slow analogy that people always use, but in this idea of it's hugely emotional as a roller coaster. It's physically exhausting over time, and you don't quite know. And there's a huge amount of time where you're in this sort of world of unknown. And if you're not calibrating for that and listening to advisors and mentors and making sure you're, taking some time off and recharging throughout that process, you're going to crash, and it's gonna, like, you're gonna hit this wall, and you're not gonna be able to get to the ultimate end goal there. And if we think about, there's all this talk around, like, so I think startups have a really bad culture by reputation sometimes, like this constant hustling kind of thing, which it takes in a very short-term perspective for that, right? It's grinding, 18 hours a day. It works for a few months, maybe a year you could do it. But if you're looking at this journey, which we are over 8, 10, 15-year time horizon, this is going to become unsustainable. And the more you burn yourself out early, the harder it will be to maintain enthusiasm and excitement and motivation as the business grows. And it's not just the burnout isn't just for us. It's what happens to the team and everything we're trying to do if we go way too hot early and burn ourselves out. So we spend a lot of time thinking about setting a good example for the team, but also making sure that we spend some time also decompressing and taking days off and doing these kind of things. So it's very, very important.
I'm glad to hear that, guys. I mean, in my own personal situation, my family life, I've entered in a very difficult stage with an injury for my wife, and it can seem very academic, these topics that we're talking about, this kindness and caring and compassion, and but when it hits you, when you need the colleagues around you to support you through difficult times, you can't just make that happen instantly. It has to have been a foundational culture you've set in place. I would talk about it again, is the ecosystem of kindness. And it's so important for the long term. I can't emphasize that enough. If you want to have long-term relationships with people, then you've got to share values and you've got to have trust. And I think it was actually Ray Dalio talked that they recognized at Bridgewater, which is the world's largest hedge funds, that in terms of having long-term relationships with each other, they recognized it wasn't competencies or intelligence of that individual as such. It was really the values that they had and whether they fit with the community. That's what was the greatest indicator for them, long-term relationships. So great to hear you're focusing on those, and you've put it so early in the business and the mission that you have. And I've massively enjoyed our conversation. I know we're getting close to an hour and a half, so I think we've probably overshot the time that we had, and we could keep going on so many topics. So I would like to end up the conversation though with one that I always do, about asking about books that have influenced you, or if you don't want to talk about books, thinkers. But yeah, do you have some books that really have helped you and that you think might help listeners understand you or have helped you in your journey? Please do share.
Ben mentioned before, I try to read as much as I can on this. I think for me, I can't point to a single, this book profoundly changed my thinking on X, and we went forward with that. There's loads of things from around how do you get a diverse and broad array of perspectives, and looking through things. You mentioned Ray Dalio and probably Principles. Is there's a ton of things that are amazing in that book, but some things that maybe fit his culture and their business that might not fit ours. But you're constantly trying to learn from the experiences and things of others and calibrating accordingly. So I think that's a fabulous one. I love Ben Horowitz's books. The Hard Thing About Hard Things, I think, is a must read for all founders, because it goes into, you read about, this journey of, Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook and Kevin Systrom and the Instagram team, and how they made billions with this iconic company and no issues whatsoever besides, data privacy things that blew up later on. But there's this truth behind how Ben Horowitz writes that book that goes into the journey of, he had a thing where, his wife was, very seriously hurt, and they were doing their IPO roadshow, and this sort of, these are situations there is no right answer. You have 600 people who might lose their job if this company goes under because you can't get public, but at the same time, the person you're most dedicated to in your life is also in a dangerous situation. And he's talking about this very emotionally, and it really resonates because there isn't a right or a wrong in a lot of these issues. So I thought that's a fabulous book. And then I love reading about people's journeys and how they've built culture and how they've built businesses and how they've thought through problems. I thought Bob Iger's book from Disney, Ride of a Lifetime, was fabulous. The Pixar team, I think, writes Ed Catmull, and those guys have written some fabulous things. So the list goes on and on. I try to curate it down to a few key ones that I do each year. So look out for that. You said
Ride of a Lifetime. Was that, you said it was the Disney?
Yeah, Bob Iger's book memoir that just came out from his time as the Disney CEO. And again, there was a really fascinating story there where he's in China for the launch of Disney World Shanghai, I think it is. And when he's there, preparing for this massive parade and this excitement, is the same day that little boy got taken by an alligator in the park and died in Florida. And this sort of dichotomy of these emotions where he has to be this excitable figurehead talking about the amazing launch of this new park and the expansion into this part of the world, while simultaneously going back to the hotel to call this family who at his park just lost their child. And it's these sort of things you're this is kind of the emotional journey that you go on in these roles, where it's not just all these rich people doing awesome stuff. It's these are people's lives being impacted, and it's this bigger thing that's all connected. And I find the journey fascinating. And I love reading about people who write about it authentically, because it's not, it's not all the up and to the right that maybe the pitch decks always show for every startup in the world, but the underlying elements of that, and then using components of all of those things to further refine and frame the way I think about things, and the way we start to form what the business wants to do. And those little pieces along the way are always helpful.
Thank you, Jerad. That's really lovely. Thank you. Ben.
Yeah, I guess on my side, it's interesting. I maybe rely on Jerad a little bit to have the more focused case studies covered. And my reading almost goes sort of all over the place in ways that seem totally unrelated to work. which I actually find is really helpful, strangely enough. So almost to try and trigger different parts of my imagination and my brain, I'll read everything on sort of a fiction side of things. I'll read, classic literature to sort of trashy fiction and popular stuff that's going through. And I think most recently a bunch of Soviet era sci-fi that I found very entertaining. And at the other end,
give us a name, Ben. What Soviet era sci-fi? You surely, what have you got?
Yeah, there's.
I'm a huge sci-fi fan, by the way. So this is manna from heaven.
Do you know things like Monday starts on Saturday, or there's a bunch by the brothers. I'm going to get their surname wrong now, which is going to be embarrassing on air. There's a couple of brothers. The surname begin with a K. Let me quickly cheekily Google it on air.
This is the joy. This is it. This is the joy of Google.
Yeah.
You got to get that out. Absolutely.
Because if I say it wrong, I'll be considered. Okay, yeah. So it's the Strugatsky brothers. There we are. I was definitely going.
The Strugatsky brothers. That is a difficult one. So
the Strugatsky brothers do a bunch of books where they're just playing with all sorts of different social systems and ideas. It's sort of in the era of various oppressive regimes in Russia, where they're sort of doing thought experiments on, okay, what would it look like if we took that to the extreme? What would it look like if we took it the other way? And they just sort of play out and fail. Like it's almost like scenario testing of every type of culture and political system you can imagine. They bring in, what if we were looking at the Earth as a giant alien experiment where the aliens are trying to crack, what political or social systems achieve justice or success or advancement most effectively. So you get some incredible thought experiments being played out in some of those fictional examples. But equally, I love reading nonfiction in totally unrelated fields. I read some motoring history recently, so I found that quite an interesting lens. Chess manuals, and my own sort of academic background is actually in sort of classical music and music theory and analysis. So I occasionally found reading very in-depth books on sonata theory, which is not of interest to any of your listeners, I suspect. Maybe one.
You never know.
If anybody has
Absolutely.
listened to this and says, I've been reading about expositions and development sections of sonatas, and then yes, I would love to connect. But it's fascinating.
I think actually a wide range of reading is a key to a healthy life. And I think, again, to quote someone I'm very fond of, who's Charlie Munger, and says by the most interesting people he ever meets in his life have all been readers. I've terribly quoted him again, but that's effectively the quote. And I found the same. My favorite, my tome in the sci-fi area is actually Dune. And every time I pick that book up, I learn something more about society and ecology and ecosystems and just the way that people think and live. And it's just a fantastic, incredibly rich book, which is also very fun to experience as well. So yeah, and then a variety of others. So I think you've given us a really lovely spectrum of books there, and I'm very thankful for you for sharing those. Well, gentlemen, I have very much enjoyed the conversation. I'd like to thank you for all the time you've given us today. If someone out there is listening who could help you guys, you'd like to have in touch, could you just share briefly, like how, what maybe who you would like to get in contact with you? If you've got any particular people out there in the audience you might want to reach out to you, how they could do that as well, and then we can wrap the show up.
I think to Jerad's point around us listening to pain points, if you're experiencing a pain point that is loosely to do with the reinsurance ecosystem, we'd love to hear from you and hear about it, rather than the other way around. Even better if it's something that it seems like we're not solving yet. So if anything in your life sucks and you work in reinsurance or loosely close to reinsurance, we'd love to hear from you.
That's a big one. There we go. Watch out, guys.
Indeed. And I was just going to add, I think we love talking about these things, and for us, especially this conversation on culture that we've been having, is a constant pursuit of better. You know, and if there's people who want to call and learn about how we approach something, if you have other founders who want to sort of bounce ideas off us or see how we tackled certain things, I love having conversations with other people on the journey, and so more than happy to have those conversations as well. So if you work in the industry and something that we're doing is of interest and you want to get involved, by all means. But if you're also on your own founder's journey and want to chat for a bit about how we've taken the approach and things, more than happy to bounce ideas off and have those conversations, because I learn as much from those as I hopefully pass along things that I've learned along the way. I think we both have benefited so much from mentorship from people further on their journey than us, and I love talking to people who are doing other things, because there's always shared experiences and things that we might encounter in the future, or we've already encountered. We can pass on how we manage that and what we would have done differently, etc. So more than happy to have any of those conversations as well.
It feels like a wonderful point to leave the show. And Bob, before we go, how should they find you? Do you have social media, various things like that?
LinkedIn is probably easiest for me. Jerad, Jerad. So for listeners who aren't familiar with my crazy American spelling of that name, but we can probably put a link in the show notes.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll put some links there for sure. Same for you, Ben?
Oh, I was just going to let all the traffic go to Jerad now. There's a few options to get involved on supercede.com as well. So if you're interested in joining our network, for example, become part of the biggest reinsurance network out there, we'll come and find you as soon as you sign up anyway. So I look forward to speaking that way, or as Jerad said, find us on LinkedIn, and we'd love to chat. Just like we have today, for a wonderful chat with you.
Thank you very much. Well, Ben, Jerad, I feel like we could have kept talking for much longer. I hope we can continue this conversation, and I'm going to be catching up with your fellow co-founder Jason later, another episode. But for now, I'd like to wish you both and the whole Supercede team lots of success in your journey. Thank you very much for your time and being here on Talent Equals. And until then.
Perfect. Thanks, William.
Thanks a lot.
Cheers. Bye.